Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. Today we will be covering chapter 9 and that's the application of international trade. So we continue our discussion about the economic welfare that we have started two chapters back. And we will continue our discussion about how the consumer surplus and producer surplus basically is applied in the concept of international trade. So as the same in the last chapter, we have seen how this concept is applied to the context of taxation, and now we will take one more step and discuss the market efficiency concept in the context of international trade. Basically we will be searching for these questions throughout this chapter. What determines how much of a good a country will import or export? So if a country is engaged in international trade, how it will be determined if a country will be an importer of a good or exporter? We will also talk about what are the benefits from trade and who gains from the trade and who loses from the trade, and do actually the gains overweight the losses. So that is one analysis, that the concept of consumer surplus and producer surplus will help us to understand, to see who will benefit from the trade and if the benefits are more or greater than the costs or the losses. And basically mostly international trade is a topic of discussion and political debate, and as you have seen in the chapter, that policymakers are involved in deciding if a country should engage in international trade or not. So that's why it's important to know if opening an economy to international trade is beneficial for a country or not, and who are the losers of international trade and who are the gainers from the international trade, and how basically that sums up together. And finally we will discuss some arguments for restricting trade. So there are some arguments that they say trade is not beneficial for a country, and we will see how economics plays a role, or what are the counter arguments related to these arguments. Okay, a prerequisite to this chapter is chapter 3, which is about international trade. We will quickly review the concept of comparative advantage, as that will help us to understand this chapter well. So as a country has a comparative advantage in a good if it produces the good at lower opportunity cost than other countries. So in the case of comparative advantage, the opportunity cost of producing a good is a determinant if a country has a comparative advantage or not. So if the opportunity cost of producing that good is lower as compared to other countries, we say that this country has a comparative advantage. And the next idea is that countries can gain from trade. When two countries or more than two countries engage in international trade, both of them can gain from trade given the concept of comparative advantage. If each exports the good in which it has a comparative advantage, as I said, that will enable both of the trading countries to gain from the trade. The graph anyway. So whenever there is a equilibrium and when there is no trade, basically the local market is comprised of domestic producers and domestic sellers. So there is no export or import taking place. So when we have a equilibrium, there is an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity that brings the supply and demand into equilibrium, and that's basically determined in a domestic market. So there is no international trade taking place so far. So in a domestic or isolated economy, the total benefit is the sum of the consumer surplus and producer surplus. We have discussed these two topics during chapter 7, so that's just a quick review. Now we will see what will happen when the economy opens to international trade. So the world price is the price of a specific good at international level. For example, in the example of textile, so what is the price of textile in international market? And that's basically the world price. So PW is basically the world price, and that equals to the price of a good, the price that prevails in world market. And PD is a domestic price without trade. So if the domestic price is smaller than the world price, domestic country has a comparative advantage, and the country exports the good. So let's imagine like a product of a textile, for example, a jacket, and the world price for that specific jacket is say 50 euros, but in a local market this jacket is produced and the price is 40 euros. So the price is lower than the world price. So what happens is that if this country opens to trade, or if the country starts trading with outside the world, the country has a comparative advantage in producing jackets. Why? Because it costs only 40 euros to produce it locally, but at the market it costs 50. So what happens is, because of this price difference, because the domestic price is lower than the world price, the country would actually export that good. So the country will export jacket to the rest of the world. Why? Because it's profitable. So producers will have a profit of extra 10 euros if they sell their product in international market. On the other side, if the domestic price is greater than the world price, So domestic country does not have comparative advantage, and that country will basically import that good. For example, if the world market for a jacket is 50 euros, but the domestic price is 70 euros, that means that it's much more cheaper, or it's beneficial to import jackets from abroad as compared to producing it locally, because the cost of production is also showing the opportunity cost of producing that good. So it makes sense for that country to import jackets from the outside. So this concept that we have discussed, it applies to the small economy. So there is this assumption that this country or this economy is quite small, and its decision on how much to produce or how much to import or export will not affect the quantity at the world level. So and also it will not affect the world price. In other words, it doesn't matter how much an economy, a small country is producing, or how much this country is exporting or importing. It will not affect the world price, and it will not affect the world quantity supplied. Why? Because this country is really small, so even if it's importing from outside, this extra demand in international market will not affect the prices, for example, to go high. So this is the assumption, and it says that a small country is a price taker in world market. Basically, what it means is that a small country cannot change the world price through its own import or export. Its action has no effect on world price, as I just said. And when a small economy engages in free trade, the world price is the only relevant price. No seller would accept less than the world price, and so that the world price is basically the prevailing price, and the small economy will take that price as taken. Okay, in this example, it's about soya beans. So let's consider a market equilibrium without trade. So as you can see, it's so now we are in a closed economy. There is no export and import. At this situation, the equilibrium price is 4 and the equilibrium quantity is 500. What happens if the country opens to international trade and the world price is basically $6? So if there is a free trade, what will happen is that the demand of the domestic consumers will fall to 300, and the domestic producer supply will increase to 750. Now this new two quantities are basically according to the new price. So 300, if you see 300 and at the price of 6, so this point is the demand for that for the soya bean at the local market, and then between 300 to 750 is basically the demand at the international level, or That's the level that would be exported. So this part of the production will be exported. Why? Because the price has risen from 4 to 6, and the companies could produce soya beans, or the farmers could produce soya beans, and then it's profitable for them to sell it at a higher price, and that will generate profit. So that's why the quantity supplied has increased from 500 to 750 if we compare it with the previous equilibrium. But the whole amount would be exported is the difference between 750 and 300. So that's 550 soya bean that will be exported at the market at the world price of 6 euros. Now we will see how the consumer surplus and producer surplus changes here. So when there is no trade, so at our first situation where the equilibrium price was 4, the consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the price, which is the area A and B. And the producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price, and that is the area C. So that's the situation without trade. And the total surplus is the surplus of consumer and producers. So the area A, B, and C is the total surplus. Now we will see what will happen to these surpluses when international trade takes place. So the consumer surplus is now the area A as compared to A and B in the case where there was no trade. Why it is the case? Because so once the market is open for international trade, the world price will also prevail in local market. So producers are now not selling the soya bean for 4 euros in local market, but they are selling it for 6 euros. And that's why when the price has increased from 4 to 2, the demand will reduce as well. So consumers will not buy, for example, more soya bean, and they will reduce their demand. So that's why the consumer surplus is reduced to A. On the other hand, the producer surplus is the area B, C, and D. So as we said in the definition of producer surplus, it's the area above the supply curve and below the price level. So now the price is 6, and if you see, the whole green area is basically above the supply line and below the price. So what happens is, if you compare it with the previous situation without trade, producers total surplus is increased by the area B and D, and B is what actually the consumer has lost, and D is the extra surplus which the producers receive from exporting. So now let's compare the whole situation. So if we consider the total surplus, what we can see that the total surplus is increased by the area D. So this export has increase the total surplus by the area D, and that's one difference when there is no trade and then when there is basically trade taking place. So the total surplus after the trade is greater than the total surplus before the trade. Of course, there are losers and winners. In this case, producers are the winners because their producer surplus is much more higher. At the same time, consumers are losers because their surplus is reduced to only the area A. So the area D is the gain from trade. This is another active learning, and you can exercise this by yourself, and you can also see what happens when the price is below the equilibrium price before the international trade. So let's quickly go through it. So what happens is without trade, the equilibrium price is 3000 and the quantity is 400, and this is the example of plasma TVs. But actually in the world market, the world price is 1500. So under free trade, how many TVs will the country import or export? So as you can see that the price is lower at the international level, so what will happen is that people will buy from abroad, and as a result the quantity demanded will raise from 400 to 600, and then your job is to find the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus without trade and with trade. So the answer is that the difference between 200 and 600, that's the amount that will be imported. Again, why this country is importing? Because previously the price was 3000, now the price is reduced by half, so that's why people are demanding more as compared to before. So their demand is now 600, and only 200 will be produced locally, and 400 plasma TVs will be imported from outside. And we can also compare the consumer surplus and producer surplus in cases when there is trade and when there was no trade and after the trade. So without trade, consumer surplus is area A, and producer surplus is area B and C, and the total surplus without trade is A, B, and C. What happens with trade? So the consumer surplus increases by the area A, B, and D, and in this case the producer surplus is only area C. So in this case, when the country is importing product, we can also see that the total surplus is increased by the area D as compared to the situation when there was no trade at all. So this area D is the gains from trade. So this table makes a summary of what will happen to export and import when the country is open to international trade, and what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. So in summary, when the domestic price is smaller than the world price, that country will basically export, and when the country is exporting, producers are benefiting. So the producer surplus will rise and consumer surplus will fall, but overall the total surplus will increase. On the other hand, when the domestic price is greater than world price, so that country will import that specific product, as we have seen in the case of plasma TVs, and as a result the consumer will benefit, so the consumer surplus will rise and the producer surplus will fall, but the overall total surplus will again rise, as we have seen in the previous example, and the area D, which was the gain from trade. Whether a good is imported or exported, trade creates winners and losers. But the gains always exceed the losses. So in total, if a country, in summary, if a country either exports or imports, the total gain will increase, and there will be both losers and winners in each situation, but overall the total surplus will increase. And it's basically, if you compare it with the economic pie, so when there is an international trade happening, the economic pie will get bigger, but there will be issues on how to slice this pie. So some people will benefit more from it, and some people will harm from that. So there is one ask the experts, and this basically shows how the experts think about trade deals. Most major trade deals have benefited most Americans. So most of the economists they believe that trade deals with other countries has benefited economics, and it's like 93% of them. So most of the experts and economists, they are in favor of international trade. Okay, it's our second main topic, and it's about the winners and losers from trade. So we just said that there will be losers and winners in trade, and we also saw how the consumer surplus and producer surplus changes after the trade, and we will explore more about losers and winners from the trade. So other benefits of international trade are that for consumers, when an international trade is happening, or when a country is engaged in international trade, the consumer will have a variety of goods to select from. So there will be an increased variety of goods. For example, in the example of textile, so if it's only local producers, there will be only few types of clothes available, or only few mark of clothes available. But when an international trade is allowed, we will see like consumer will have different brands and different type of clothes in their markets, or their choices will increase. So they have different brands and different producers of clothes, and they can choose from. So that's something good. That's an additional benefit for consumers. So in case if the country is exporter, what will happen that their cost will be reduced. Why? Mainly because economies of scale. So the concept of economies of scale is that if you're producing in a large scale, your cost will be reduced. So what happens is that, for example, this country is as an exporter of a specific good, and now they will produce more of that good and they will export. So as a result, the scale of production will increase, so that company will expand more, and as a result, the cost will be lower for that company. And also there will be more competition in local level, because now foreign suppliers are also competing with local firms, and as a result, the local or domestic firms will have less economic market power, so they are not able to, for example, charge higher prices, or they also faces a competition from abroad. They will also, for example, improve their quality of products. So as a result, because there is more competition in the market and no one has a market power, or domestic firm, they don't have a market power, the total welfare will increase. And last, as a result of international trade, there will be also the flow of information and technology. So different countries will benefit from that, and they will benefit from the technologies that have been developed in other countries, for example, and they will also be exposed to other international ideas from other countries, and that will basically enable an international economic development in a general sense. So far we have been talking about the benefits that international trade results in. We have talked the main benefits is through the analysis of consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus, and we also give some reasons that goes beyond these analysis and that international trade is beneficial. And now we will talk why some people are opposing international trade. The one reason is that losers have more incentive to organize and lobby for restrictions on trade. That's one main issue, that those who are losing from international trade, they are well organized, and then they can take actions, or they can influence government policymakers, for example, through lobbying and influencing so that the international trade is changed or restricted, and they will continue to receive the benefits from that. And one reason is that because they are well organized, they are able to influence government policies. For example, as we said in previous example, that in the market of textiles, for example, if the economy is open to international trade, and the international price is lower than the local price, so what happens is that the consumer will benefit from that, but the producer will face losses. So what will happen, that the textile company owners, they will get together, and then they will lobby in government, and then they will try to restrict international trade. Why? Because they are the losers, and they have this incentive to organize and lobby for more trade restrictions. And but this gain from the international trade is spread over many people, and for them it's really difficult to get organized and to lobby for their own benefits. So if there was a way to compensate the losers of the international trade, that will basically solve the problem, but this process is not easy, so it's very difficult to compensate the losers of international trade. And because it's still profitable to engage in international trade, but even if you compensate the losers of international trade, but because this process is very difficult, so that's not taking place in real world. So the winners from trade could compensate the losers and still be better off. For example, if it was the case, we will still be benefiting from international trade, but such compensation rarely occurs. Okay, now we will talk about tariffs, and tariffs are basically a topic of international trade, and tariff is actually a tax on goods produced abroad and sold domestically. So as we have seen in the previous chapter about the cost of taxation, and tariff is also a type of tax. So it's quite similar to the analysis that we have made in the last chapter, but we will see it how it affects international trade. So tariff is a tax on goods produced abroad and sold domestically. So when the government imposes a tariff, the amount of import those companies that are importing that specific good, they have to pay an extra amount to the government based on the quantities of that good that they are producing. So that's basically a type of tax that the importers are paying to the government. And in the case of free trade, so the domestic price equals the market price, and tariff on import raises domestic price above the world price. So when a tariff is imposed on imports, that basically raises the domestic price above the world price. And the amount that it raises is the amount of the we can see it here. For example, the example of tariff on cotton shirts. So the world price is $20, and buyers demand 80 units of shirts at the free market or free trade. So what happens is that the sellers supply 25 shirts and imports another 55 or 55 units is being imported from abroad. Okay, now let's see that the government imposes a tariff of $10 per shirt. So any shirt which will be imported to the country, the importer have to pay $10 to the government. So what happens is that by this $10, it basically raises the price of the shirt to $30 from $20. So this $10 is added to the price of the imported shirt. So now the price of shirt is $30. And as a result, because the price has increased from 20 to 30, consumers will now buy only 70 shirts as compared to 80 shirts when there was no tariff. And local firms now are supplying 40 shirts. So local firms are now producing more as compared to the situation when there was no tariffs. So before they were producing 25 shirts, now as a result of tariff, they are producing 40 shirts. Why? Because the price has risen. So the price was 20 when there was international trade, and the firms will only producing 25 units. Now that the prices are 30 euros, firms have the incentive to provide more, so they are producing 40 units. And as a result, the imports is shrunk, or it's reduced to 30 units. Again, why import has reduced? Because the price has risen through imposing of this 10 euro tariff on shirt. Okay, now we will see what happens to consumer surplus, producer surplus in case of a tariff. So let's see what happens in case of free trade before tariff. The consumer surplus is the area of A, B, C, D, E, and F. So all the area below the demand curve and above the price level. And the producer surplus is only the area G, and that's the area above the supply curve and below the price level. So this whole area is the total surplus of both producers and sellers. So that's the situation when the country is trading in a free market or in a free situation. So now we will consider what will happen when the government imposes a tariff of 10 euros, for example. Now the price has increased to 30 euros. So the consumer surplus is the area A and B, the area below demand curve and above the price. And producer surplus is the area C and G. And government is receiving this revenue, which is shown in the area E, and that's basically the 30 quantities of shirts imposed multiplied by 10, so it's the $300 that the government will receive from imposing this tariff. And basically government revenue is also considered as a surplus, but not to producers or consumers, but to the government. But still we will consider that as a area of surplus, or as a gain from international trade. So the total surplus is now the area which is highlighted in green. And as you could remember from the previous chapter, we have been talking about deadweight losses, and here you can see that the area D and F are the two deadweight losses. D is from the producer side because they are producing extra unit, although their costs are much more higher than at the international level. And F is the loss to the consumers because they wanted to buy 80 units, for example, but now because of the tariff, they have reduced their demand, or their demand is reduced to 70s. If there was no taxes, so they would have engaged in trade and they would have bought 10 more units of shirts, which would increase their economic welfare by the area F. But because there is taxes, so they are not able to engage in this transaction. So this is the F is the last area for the consumers, or the consumer surplus. As I said, both of these two areas are the deadweight loss that we have discussed in the last chapter as well. So D is the area of overproduction of shirt, and F is the deadweight loss for the underconsumption of shirts by the consumers. Okay, import quotas are not discussed in the chapter, but we will quickly go through it. What is import quota? Import quota is quantitative limits on the import of a good. So a country would say, I will only import that specific amount of good from one country. And its effect is the same as tariff. So its effect on the consumer surplus and producer surplus is the same as tariffs. It raises price, reduces quantity of imports. And it also reduces buyers' welfare, but increases sellers' welfare, so it's benefiting so it's benefiting the sellers, and it's affecting negatively the buyers of that specific good. On the other hand, it also creates profit for the foreign producers of the imported goods, who can sell them at the higher prices. So now if a quota is imposed, and the foreign producers will also benefit from it. And yeah, so what happens is that foreign producers, they will sell it at a higher price for the importers, and that's how it will benefit foreign producers. Okay, so our last topic is we will talk about some arguments for restricting trade, and we will see why these arguments are not sound or why they are not feasible. The first argument is the job argument, is that some people say like international trade will affect domestic job markets, and some people, for example, they will lose their job. In the example of textiles, so those who are producing textiles, or the employees of textile industry, they will basically lose their job if international trade is allowed. So this argument says that trade with other countries destroys domestic jobs. But the main argument is that free trade creates jobs at the same time that it destroys them. So of course, those who have been working in the textile industries, some of them they will lose their job, but at the same time there will be other industries in which the country will have comparative advantage, and for example they could have find jobs in that industry. But of course it's a short-term distraction in the labor market, and it takes time for labor to shift from one industry to another industry. So that's why international trade has some losers and winners. But this argument that international trade destroys local jobs is invalid in the sense that it also creates job in other industries, in the industries in which the country is good at, or in the industries in which the company has a competitive advantage. Yeah, so overall the total employment will not change in the long run, at least, because the job gains in export industry will compensate for the job loss in the industry which is the import industry, or the industry which is affected. Here you can see an example from the United States imports and unemployment rate from 1955 to 2014. The red line shows import as a percentage of GDP, and the blue line shows the unemployment rate. So as you can see, although the import rate or the import of the United States has increased over this period, the unemployment rate is not directly increased at the same time. So as you can see, there is no direct correlation between imports and unemployment rate. The next argument is about the national security argument. Some people argue that some industries are vital and important for national security, and that's why it should be protected. This could be true in case there is a legitimate concern over national security. But mostly it is exaggerated that the specific industry is should be protected because of the national security, and in some cases even it has been shown that it could be beneficial because it has been in the book. There is an example of the military weapon and guns and other stuff. So in that example, because the price is lower abroad, so it's economical to buy it from abroad and then with a cheaper price. So this argument of national security is not completely valid, but yeah, that's also one argument against the free international trade. The next argument is about the infant industry argument, and this argument says that new industries need temporary trade restriction to help them get started. So some companies say that we are not able to compete with international trade, so that's why we need some protection at the beginning, in order that we establish and then that we can produce later on or compete later on. But this argument is also not valid, because in any case the international the infant industry, if it's profitable at the beginning, they will incur cost, or they will incur losses anyway. But if they think that this industry is profitable in the long run, So in that case, they will accept this initial loss in order to gain profits in the future. So this infant industry argument is not always valid. And it's also difficult to implement because it's hard to decide which industry to protect and which not to. And mostly it's a political decision, or it's mostly those who are those who can influence the government, they will try to get protection for their own industry. And another argument is that once this policy is being implemented, or when there is an industry being protected against international trade, it's very difficult or hard to remove this protection later on. And also, as we said, each industry does not need protection to grow, because at the beginning, in any case, they have to incur losses in order to get established and then start production, but their initial losses will be compensated by the profits later on. The next argument is about the unfair competition argument. So in this argument, it says that when there is a free trade, so all the companies or all the parties or all the countries should have the same rules for the game. For example, in some cases, there are countries in which one industry is being subsidized by government, so in order that they could compete at international level. But this argument is not valid also, because even if a country is subsidizing its export industry, that actually benefits the country which is receiving these imports. Why? Because the subsidy will allow the cost of production to reduce for that company, and that will also reduce their prices. So as a result, the importing country will receive these goods in a lower price, and that's due to the subsidy that the first exporting country has given to that industry. So in that case, it's not actually hurting the importing country, but instead it's actually benefiting that country. So that's what it says, that we should welcome imports of low-cost produced products subsidized by the other countries' taxpayers. So if other countries' taxpayers are paying for that industry to export goods, basically the benefits is received by the importing country. The gains to our consumers will exceed the losses to our producers. Yeah, so if in any case the consumer surplus will be more than the losses of the producer. And the last argument is the protection as a bargaining chip argument, and that's basically saying that you use protection as a way of bargaining with other countries. For example, you would say, I will impose tariff on your consumer goods that are being imported to our country, and they will also have a similar argument. So it was recently the case during the Donald Trump in China. So Donald Trump imposed taxes on Chinese product, and then China also imposed tariffs and taxes on the US product. So at the end, it hurt both economies of both countries, and mostly it was the consumers who had to pay higher costs for the Chinese product in America, and also the consumers who had to pay higher prices for the American products in China. So using the protection argument as a bargaining chip is not valid because it hurts both countries. If it's kept, and if it's not kept, then it will hurt the ego of that country, which didn't keep the initial promise of imposing a protection. Yeah, so the argument is that trade restriction can be useful when we bargain with our trading partners, but this trade may not work. And that's one example of it that you can read. There is also a case study about World Trade Organization, and that I will skip for now because we are running out of time, but you can read that one. Okay, so I will summarize this chapter. A country will export a good if the world price of the good is higher than the domestic price without trade. So a company is an exporter if the price of that good is higher in the international level. So in that case, the producer will produce more, and then they will export. Trade raises producer surplus, reduces consumer surplus, and raises total surplus. So when a country is exporting a good, it basically the producer surplus will increase, but the consumer surplus will be reduced, and as a result, the total surplus will rise. On the other hand, a country will import a good if the world price is lower than the domestic price without trade. In that case, the trade lowers producer surplus but raises consumer surplus, and the total surplus also increases. A tariff benefits producers and generates revenue for the government, but the losers to consumers exceed these gains. So consumers are basically losing from this situation, but the gains are again higher. So some of the arguments against trade are protecting job, defending national security, helping infant industry, preventing unfair competition, and responding to foreign trade restrictions. As we discussed, in some situation there could be some small merits in it, but overall most of the economists believe that free trade is beneficial for all countries involved in international trade.